Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. One way of achieving political goals is to put pressure on a state, and one way of doing this is sanctions, restrictions and limitations on goods, trade, industry, as well as specific individuals. Regimes, however, are learning how to circumvent these mechanisms, with some being so adept at it that you'd be forgiven for thinking they have just snapped up an infinite dodge ability upgrade. At the forefront here is Russia and its ability to circumvent hydrocarbon restrictions, which has played a key role in its economic performance. In particular, the country bypassed export controls and continued to sell oil around the world despite the price cap imposed. This was achieved through a shadow fleet, allowing Russian oil to reach markets with crude without being subject to the cap. Ever thought of how a foreign affairs equivalent of the Mo throws Barney Simpson's meme would look like? Well, yeah, this is Russia in a nutshell. However, sanctions also work the other way around. In Russia, you won't get your favorite burger from a world-famous restaurant, although there is plenty of fakes on offer. Modern electronic components, aircraft parts and other Western-made goods are also harder and harder to come by. Belarusian strongman and President Alexander Lukashenko has been among the victims of this particular breed of sanctions recently, much to his dismay. So, did he weather the storm of sanctions or was he forced to back down? More on that in our latest report.
Ilya Yashin, a Russian dissident recently released from political detention as part of a major swap between the West and Russia, has drawn attention to the role political prisoners play in Belarus's scheme to circumvent sanctions. He argued that Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko has recently been pardoning political prisoners in exchange for spare parts for the state airline Belavia. On the one hand, this proves that Western sanctions against Belarus and Russia are having an effect. On the other, the two dictatorships are getting ever craftier with their ways of bypassing restrictions. When it comes to Russia, the West's attempt to induce as much capital flight as possible with the initial shock of the measures that the US announced in the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has proven insufficient. Trying to engineer a freefall for the ruble with a view to trigger skyrocketing import inflation denting the purchasing power of Russian consumers was ultimately checked by Moscow. An ensuing negative feedback loop of the central bank increasing interest rates coupled with investment drought was ultimately arrested by Russian leader Vladimir Putin, deciding to implement capital controls. Earlier this month, the Biden administration imposed sanctions against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and 16 of his affiliated officials for undermining the electoral process and violating the civil and human rights of Venezuela's citizens. To date, the U.S. has sanctioned over 140 current and former Venezuelan officials, while also taking steps to impose visa restrictions on about 2,000 individuals. The efficiency of these measures seems limited as the Maduro regime continues enjoying the renewal of lucrative oil contracts with the U.S. Last month's reports from the Venezuelan Central Bank showed that the country's gross domestic product expanded nearly 9% year-over-year in the second quarter. This is a sharp rise from the 3% logged in the same quarter a year ago.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. Over the years, many anecdotes have grown up around Russian and Belarusian airlines. Easy to say, these carriers were not among the safest to begin with. When the war in Ukraine began, the planes were not that safe already. Now, however, things are apparently getting worse. One would suspect that even the illegal migrants scooped up by the Russian authorities and tricked into thinking that crossing the border between Poland and Belarus illegally is the opportunity of a lifetime may actually take exception to flying Russian airlines for fear of possible accidents. And of course, let's not forget the case of the hijacking of a Polish plane flying over Belarusian territory with Roman Protasevich on board. In September this year, the Polish National Prosecutor's Office charged those responsible for the hijacking. This is unrelated to the topic of sanctions per se, but it does give you a hint as to how airline safety looks like in Lukashenko's Belarus. A time passed and more planes broke down. At the same time, there was a shortage of spare parts to repair them. As a result of sanctions on aircraft components shipments, Lukashenko literally had to trade political prisoners for spare parts, according to latest reports. During a meeting with his supporters in Vilnius, Ilya Yashin a Russian opposition activist, and until recently a political prisoner of Vladimir Putin, revealed details on how the seemingly grotesque concept of prisoner exchange for aircraft parts actually works. Specifically, Yashin had this to say. Lukashenko has a problem with Belarus. He needs to repair a plane, he needs some parts which he cannot get because of sanctions, and he literally exchanges people for plane parts. Yikes. Some suspect even Lukashenko's personal equivalent of Air Force One, perhaps Air Farce One might be a fitting name, could have fallen victim to the parts shortage in question, forcing the dictator to undergo the indignity of prisoner release. Now that allows us to ask the following question. Do sanctions really work? According to human rights organization Vyasna, there are more than 1,400 political prisoners in Belarus. Since the beginning of July, there have been 4 waves of pardons of political prisoners from Belarusian prisons and penal colonies, with 115 people released. Still, Lukashenko's rule did not crumble, and like a wounded bear, the regime rumbles on, which forces the West to think about further incentives designed to disrupt the Moscow-Minsk alliance. And now here to shed more light on the issue is our guest today, Anatol Kotau from the Forum of Democratic Forces of Belarus. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, nice to meet you.
So these reports about Lukashenko trading political prisoners for aircraft parts, of all things, it sounds rather grotesque. How much do you think of these reports is actually true, and what does it tell us about the condition of the regime itself?
I guess we are not yet at that point. Then Lukashenko will start selling prisoners, political prisoners, for the spare parts for aircraft. I guess that the recent releases of political prisoners more have in common with the policy of Poland and China, who are putting pressure on Lukashenko regime. But to some extent, these rumors have something, I would say, in common with reality, because Lukashenko cares about aircraft, but not about Belarus, but about his own personal aircrafts, which are under sanctions right now. And it's not a big secret, actually, that he is trying to get them out of sanction lists, because it's all about his personal security. He doesn't care about ordinary people who are flying with not so safe aircraft as several years before. But he cares extremely, he cares too much about his own personal security.
Well, I mean, after all, dictatorships and selflessness, that actually doesn't really go hand in hand, does it? On the other hand, the love of luxury certainly does. But you've mentioned that there is a pressure originating from Poland and China. Can you tell us more about it? As it seems hardly conceivable that these two countries would be acting together. So I'm assuming these are two separate lines of pressure there.
Something like this, but it's something like it's some sort of paradox. But in case of Belarus, Polish and Chinese interests have much in common, because it's about it's about external trade, and it's about transit via Belarus. China is I would say, is a great exporter of its own goods to Europe, and China has, I would say, embarrassing big ties with European Union and Poland in particular as a trade partner. And of course, China is interested that nobody in between China and the European Union and Poland in particular is creating some artificial problems on this Silk way, on this Silk route of Chinese goods being delivered to Europe. And Belarusian dictator, Belarusian regime, for more than 3 years is attacking European borders with illegal migration. Also, there is an issue of smuggling goods, and it's about sanctions escaping. So this all brings Poland to difficult decisions, and in July this year we've been witnessed and Poland closed the railway transit for more than 30 hours, and it worked out because actually immediately after that action Lukashenko started to release political prisoners. And as far as I know, this move or this action was coordinated with China. China was informed that it's Belarusian regime who is to be blamed for these problems on the way of Chinese transit to Europe.
Essentially, regimes that want to challenge the global order, you have Iran, North Korea, Russia, and you have Belarus, well, basically acting as an accomplice. So would China say, okay, so we just want Belarus out of the picture here?
You see, we are not speaking here about the complete adjustment or complete change of the regime in Belarus. It's more about short-term and mid-term interests and economic interests in particular. So, and here the interests of European Union and China are not so different. So they want to trade peacefully, and of course China is not preventing Russia nor Belarus from taking part in the war against Ukraine. That's true. I'm also using the diplomatic language. But on the other hand, China needs more stability in the region. At least these railways which are passing through Russia and Belarus are secured. And now the level of turbulence provided and caused by Belarus and to less extent by Russian regimes are more than China would tolerate. So that's why I'm speaking that it's paradox, but in the short and mid-term there is I would say, pressure from both sides, and of course Lukashenko won't be taken out of the hook immediately if he releases all the political prisoners, and even if he stops, which we don't see right now, to take new hostages, because we have two processes ongoing simultaneously. He released more than 100 political prisoners recently during past 2.5 months, which is, I would say, record in his history, in the history of Belarusian regime. But on the other hand, each and every day he is taking new hostages, and there are new political prisoners appearing in Belarus. So the total number remains almost the same.
That's a very important point to actually notice, that this regime is still basically continuing along its own ways. It is not in any way changing its approach, quite the contrary. But let me ask you another question. So we're talking about Belarus as a country that has proved to be partially susceptible to sanctions, like it cannot really ignore them, just shrug them off and move on. But we also have Russia, which proved to be very adept at dodging sanctions. Should Russia be given as an example, as some people do, to support the idea that sanctions don't work? Because skeptics say sanctions are ineffective. Just look at Russia. They have GDP still growing, the economy is not collapsing, and the regime is far from being unseated by any sort of pressure from society. So what would be your take on this?
Actually, the issue of sanctions is extremely complex. because we cannot say that sanctions do not work or are not working completely. Russian GDP is growing because of the artificial inflow, which is connected directly to the war against Ukraine. So it's about military that actually drags this Russian GDP to be higher than a year before, and this is some sort of artificial. If the war ends, or actually when the war ends, Russian GDP will just drop down drastically. And the same is applied to Belarus. So it's not only about looking at figures, it's also about looking deeper into the nature of this economic growth. And it's all about war. And the war ends, Russian GDP drops down. And if we speak about actually how the sanction work, of course it's difficult to apply say 100% efficient sanctions against such a big country as Russia, particularly because they have big internal market, they have plenty of natural resources, so they could survive almost all I would say sanctions, but all this also connected with the deterioration processes within Russian or Belarusian society. So in a long-term perspective, sanctions are working. And there is one more very important issue about sanctions. Actually, two issues, 2 points I would like to add here. First one is that sanctions won't be efficient until there are countries which help the aggressor, help in this case Russia or Belarus, to avoid these sanctions. And we see that many countries which are parties of Eurosec Union, they have a drastic increase of international trade or foreign trade with European Union or United States. 100% growth. This means that they are helping, they are assisting both Russia and Belarus to avoid the sanctions. And the second point is that actually only countries which would like to be a part of something, to be a part of Western civilization, to be a part of a Western economic club, will follow the sanctions. Those who are against the, say, world peaceful order or something like this, any system, who are criminals, who are criminal by nature, actually they won't obey any sanctions. And here the examples not only of Russia and contemporary Belarus, it's also about Iran, it's also about Northern Korea, and it's also about Venezuela.
So effectively, sanctions dodging has become a national pastime in these countries. But this is mostly because these regimes, as you indicated, have no real interest in supporting the current world order. Instead, they would like to undermine it. And if judging sanctions is what it takes to do that, they will unfortunately be more than happy to comply with this. Anatol Kotau was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. It seems that Russia's recent test of its intimidating intercontinental ballistic missile has fizzled out. Take a look at this report to learn how Moscow's latest plaything went out with a bang.
Russia may not be that good at rocket science after all. According to Belsat, satellite footage showed a large crater in place of a launch silo at the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in Russia's northwest region of Arkhangelsk. This is where a test launch of Moscow's super-heavy intercontinental ballistic missile Sarmat was planned to take place. Analysts suggest that the missile might have exploded during fueling procedures. Boasting a range of 18,000 kilometers, the missile can carry a wide variety of warhead options, including nuclear. Sarmat's latest failed launch was at least the fourth for this type of missile.
And we're not done yet with explosive topics. Tallying up Russia's losses resulting from Ukraine's attack on its ammo depot in the Tver Oblast last week, the UK's defense intelligence said Moscow will find it increasingly difficult to carry out military operations, including in the Kursk region.
Kyiv's attack on Russia's munitions depot in Teropets, about 500 kilometers from Ukraine's border, has caused massive losses that will make it difficult for Russia to conduct ground operations, especially in the Kursk region. The depot almost certainly held a wide variety of munitions marked for use on the front line. Up in flames also went missiles and glide bombs launched from nearby military airfields. The facility was also reported to have contained munitions imported from North Korea. A total of 30,000 tons of arms was stored at the depot, one of Russia's largest. The resulting explosion set off a minor tremor and a fire that spread over 6 kilometers.
Over 50 miners were reported dead following a blast in a coal mine in Iran. Here is a look at the tragic event in greater detail.
A methane leak caused a blast in a mine located in Tabas, eastern Iran. The death toll so far is 51 people, with at least 20 more injured. It is believed that 24 miners are still trapped underground. Some 70 people had been working inside the mine when the blast occurred. Iran's new reformist president, Masoud Pezeshkian, said no effort will be spared to rescue those trapped and aid their families. He also said that an investigation into the incident had been opened. As many as 76% of the country's coal comes from the Tabas region.
As the US is considering sending Ukraine medium-range missiles for its new F-16 fleet, Kyiv is now in talks with European partners on providing the embattled country with other 4th and 5th generation fighter jets, including the Eurofighter. More on that in our report.
Ukraine's Western allies, including the US, continue restricting its use of long-range weapons, which has reduced the F-16s they have provided to a predominantly defensive role. The ban on long-range weapons renders the F-16s more vulnerable and less efficient. Another detriment is the small number of Western-provided jets at Ukraine's disposal. Denmark, Norway, Belgium and the Netherlands have pledged over 85 F-16s to Ukraine, but the number delivered in August remains unspecified. Meanwhile, Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov stressed that the army needed more than just F-16s and Mirage 2000s. Now, Kyiv is eyeing Swedish-made Gripen and pan-European Eurofighter jets to make an addition to Ukraine's arsenal. Consultations on the provision of the jets are reportedly underway.
And that's all for now on Eastern Express. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.